I want to just talk about one other thing for a few minutes with you. So you and I have, look, there is a fundamental danger to any form of left-wing project, media, or the really important things we see. We're going to do a story next week on the social media documentation showing that the tactics of, example, cops kneeling is migrating back from counterinsurgency tactics from U.S. military occupations in Afghanistan and Iraq. That these social media platforms across the board offer, a certain capacity to do a certain type of commentary and analysis, along with all the other just absolutely poisonous and awful things that they do to all of us. And I'm a bigger and bigger media skeptic every single day of the week. And if you can, I'd strongly urge you to get the hell off of social media. It's terrible. But
yeah, I wouldn't be on it if I didn't have to be, because of stuff like this. I would have deleted that account long ago.
Yeah, it's so, but the ultimate question becomes, do we recognize that things like Google or public utilities, they need to become public commons? The internet is actually a hybrid of a commons and a project of the military industrial complex. And the political project is to make it less of a commons, more of a commons, and less of a privatized product of the military industrial complex. And, one of the ways this argument has shown up is about whether or not we want to petition these companies basically for censorship. And the argument has always been that, at the end of the day, calling for censorship is not favorable terrain for the left. And that's obvious. And even like the first wave of things we saw when, companies went after the most deserving targets, the ultra scumbag Alex Jones, Gavin McInnes, just, fucking scum of the earth. It already started to, as an example, the Atlanta Council team up with Facebook to try to vet foreign policy coverage. And that, as an example, hit Telesur. So the point was from the beginning, Silicon Valley wasn't saying we're journalistic platforms and we're going to start having an editorial process. They were moving towards the direction of basically like, after incentivizing a bunch of extreme right-wing content, particularly on YouTube, now maybe it's less controversial. We want to make things more like cable TV. Anyways, I say all of this, and I accept that there are specific things on a case-by-case basis that I think there's completely legitimate differences of opinion about. As far as of getting different people off the platform. But the underlying base argument, and again, the difference between a liberalism and a socialism, is the fight to make commons be commons and democratic commons versus, calling the manager, is really coming to a fore. And there's a great new Matt Taibbi piece on the censorship of the Michael Moore movie, Planet of the Humans, which we've criticized pretty extensively on the show. Some people say unfairly. I actually think we managed to have a balanced conversation about it, but we rigorously critiqued it. Planet of Censoring the Humans, a campaign to remove Michael Moore's new documentary from the internet, led by Moore's erstwhile progressive allies, is a significant advance in the censorship revolution. This is Matt Taibbi. And he goes on to talk basically about within 24 hours of it going on YouTube, people got to work trying to take the film down, explains Moore. He immediately started hearing about emails denouncing the film that were being circulated in what seemed like everyone on the left, and it goes on to explain that. And I'm not interested in getting into any of the sort of, the platform cited a 4-second piece of footage shot by filmmaker Toby Smith that was supposedly a copyright infringement. Moore, who says all of his films are, quote, heavily lawyered, insists the footage was under legal under fair use laws, which allow portions of copyrighted work without permission of the owner. In one of many ironies, fair use laws have been celebrated by progressives as an invaluable tool for journalists and artists. They are, and I could tell you working on YouTube that this has already become a huge problem that didn't exist several years ago and now significantly restricts one's ability to, as an example, we have that great beat by Napoleon the Legend that he made himself.
Mm-hmm.
We get copyright hits on. We've gotten the AP, which is a public good journalism operation, will destroy anything that uses any of its footage, even stuff that's again that's in the historical common domain. So, anyways, very long preamble, but Ben, I think the move, and I think this is really illustrating it, because in fact, there already was a very dynamic public debate about this movie. There was a lot of great defenses of it. There was a lot of significant criticisms of it. Sort of the point. And, I have to say, if we're any step out of, you get rid of Nazi shit wherever you see it, which I hear, or, you get rid of something that is maybe going to literally put somebody directly in harm's way because it's lying about a medical issue. Honestly, I have a pretty strong, free speech bias, but I think those are the two exception arguments that I'm open to hearing. But everything else, I have to say, I think is enormously dangerous and bullshit. And this is kind of the extreme example of it, seems to me. Critique this movie, but my God, if you're calling for it to be pulled down, it threatens what everybody does.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, before even getting into the more substantive issues, I think that just being real about this, if you are in favor of pulling this movie because of your critique of it as an environmentalist, then you're not living in the real world whatsoever. Because look, just to put this a fine point on this, and don't get me wrong, I've I thought that when you were talking Joshua Kahn Russell, I think a lot of the criticisms of the movie that were mentioned there made sense to me. Our friend Lee Phillips at Jacobin said a lot of critical things about it that made sense to me. But first of all, Michael Moore might get yanked from YouTube, but you can still find thousands of hours of right-wing climate denialism on YouTube easily, right? Michael Moore is yanked, but you can still find, the cool kids philosopher Ben Shapiro talking about how no problem, you just sell your oceanfront property, which should tell you something about the idea that this is a good terrain from the left, giving the corporate media giants more of these censorship tools, and also to that point, I thought Lee Phillips made good points about it. I thought Joshua Kahn Russell made good points about it. But if honestly, what the main effect I think of Planet of the Humans being out there is that it's going to get more people thinking about what the demands of an environmental movement should be, and they're more likely to seek out critiques like that. And it's certainly at the very damn least, that's much more true than it is of all kinds of just outright climate denialist stuff that's all over YouTube. So what was going through the head of anybody who was involved in this push is beyond me. And taking a step back from that, it's also worth thinking about the larger way that we think about free speech and censorship, because when you think about even those early examples with, targets who are much more, much more deserving than Michael Moore, obviously, right? Like Alex Jones, which, I think in that case, the result, you can make a case for, right? That, you say, if nothing else, the man was peddling junk medicine on, to people who might have thought that it was real. And that's the kind of thing that that might, under a reasonable set of rules might actually get you kicked off YouTube. But whatever you think about the result, we should be extremely disturbed to see the fact that YouTube and Twitter and all of them could just do that without really having to explain themselves to anybody, without having to even pretend to be abiding by any sort of consistent, transparent set of rules. And I was particularly disturbed when those things happened. And really, I think Michael Moore being censored proves the point, that we're not, we can't just count on this staying limited to these, hucksters like Alex Jones. But when that happened, one of the things that disturbed me the most about it was that I was seeing not lots of progressives, even people who might think of themselves as to the left of liberalism, just falling back into this libertarian view of what free speech is. That they say, oh, well, free speech protects you from the government, but YouTube's not a government. It's a private company. It can do whatever it wants with its platform, which, as you point out, is not exactly true anyway, because they claim that they're not responsible for the content because they don't have editorial discretion. But more importantly than that, right? Like, this is something that certainly as socialists we should just categorically reject wherever we see it, because you might as well say, McDonald's is a private company. It should be able to pay people for whatever it wants, right?
Honestly, actually,
there.
I just want to say, though, there's an even more direct. There's a closer through line, which is that several years ago there was case law that was developing that said, as an example, posting OSHA guidelines in a workplace was a violation of a company's free speech. Like, they didn't want to put on the wall that you were entitled to a certain amount of time.
Yeah.
They didn't want, that's their free speech, man. They're individuals. So I think that
McDonald's, that's McDonald's wall. What they can put whatever they want or not put it on their wall. Who you tell them get your own wall and put it up there. And
exactly. That is a really, one. And then there's also just the idea that, in fact, we should be way more confident and willing to take things on and actually compete. But I agree with you. I think it's okay, if all of a sudden the position becomes, we basically don't have a public commons, everything is in a handful of monopoly tech platforms that we petition with a zero transparency about anything. And then at the end of the day, they can do whatever they want because it's a private platform. The kind of politics and society we want is always losing.
No question, right? And I think that when people have this super narrow, free speech is just a legal concept as understood by the First Amendment, one thing I'd point out is that, as much as it might shock some Americans, free speech is a concept that does exist in other societies elsewhere and before the American First Amendment was written, right? This is a value that people cared about. But also, why do we care about that, right? For all sorts of reasons, we want to live in a society where there's a fairly free flow of information, right, so people can be exposed to all kinds of different perspectives. And if you take this super legalistic libertarian understanding of what that means, and we live in a society where a few companies can control an absolutely ridiculous percentage of the flow of information, then that's sort of been reduced to a legal technicality. And last point about this, I think that that it does speak to that fear that you're talking about of taking things on more directly. And I think the real thing that it speaks to is, what Daniel Bessner is always talking about how Chomsky is great, but when you read leftists from that generation, right, that sort of Chomsky generation, it's always clear that the idea of kind of winning or taking power is never really on their radar, and fair enough, because the time they're writing in, right? But the problem is, if that becomes off the table, then politics starts to be less a matter of trying to change the world than just taking a sort of individual moral stand against things that deserve condemnation. And I think that the limits of that perspective are really on display here when people think that they see something that I think it's an exaggerated reaction in the Moore movie, right? But in other cases, they might have better reasons, right? They see something they don't like, right? That and their first instinct is to tattle to the corporate overlords to try to get them to take it down for them, because all they're thinking about in terms is, hey, is this thing I'm objecting to really bad or not? If it's really bad, we should just oppose it by means necessary. And if you disagree, you must not think it's really bad. Now, in the Moore case, I don't think it's really bad. I think it's complicated and it gets some stuff wrong, right? But
it's complicated. Well, and that's the other thing too, is that this stuff always begins with, I mean, you know, that is again why you defend the worst shit, because it always starts with the easiest stuff to target.
Exactly.
You know, I mean, that's just the nature of the beast. And then before you know it, and we see it on all these platforms, the incentive is for them to just look like cable news. Griscom, you had something.
Yeah, I just like specifically to that, you know, the example that Americans always like to give, you know, you learn it when you're studying U.S. government, is like, what is the limit on free speech? And they say, oh, well, you can't shout fire in a crowded theater. Well, you know, the citation from that comes from Oliver Wendell Holmes, who was using that as justification for the imprisonment of a bunch of anti-war Jewish socialists who were opposing the United States' involvement in the Great Imperial World War I. You know, so it's just like, you don't even have to say like, yeah, well, they were coming after the easiest group because that's like, you know, a marginalized political group, but one that, you know, was very right and righteous. And you see it with the way that these tech platforms act. You know, like all of this censorship just hits the left so hard.
It's always, so the way it will always be is you might find some examples of truly obscene examples on the right.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
And then the overall context should be just like anything else. How do you get rid of the context that people are interested in Al-Qaeda? How do you get rid of the interest in the context that people are interested in all the alt-right? There's always still the same material strategic work that needs to be done. Then you start going in and you start saying this stuff should go, da-da-da-da-da. And then the companies are looking at their new plans and their new strategies. That, you know, YouTube is deciding it doesn't want to be the kind of like, you know, indie medium that it was 4 or 5 years ago. So, okay, they're going to stop incentivizing this obscene shit, which they absolutely did. And then it's going to be like, okay, we'll go after the really bad guys. But then we're going to start to gradually disincentivize anything that is outside of the quote unquote mainstream. And then you'll have the same dynamic, you know, that you'd see, frankly, in just like mainstream corporate press, which is incentivizing cable news, corporate media. And then there is always an infrastructure on the right that is funded and can either bypass it entirely or, again, is just, you know, the analogs that are, you know, to just even people doing stuff independently on the left are people that can get, you know, funding from the Koch brothers and things like that. So that terrain never favors, you know, it never favors. And again, it never favors the left. And historically, the left, for both ideological and practical reasons, was always unapologetic about the, you know, fierce commitment to free speech for partially those very obvious and strategic reasons.
Yeah,
so
I mean,
we need to get back to that.
Yeah. Yeah, no question. I mean, the ACLU, backwards, the American Civil Liberties Bureau, was to a great extent founded by socialists, right? One of the initial people was Norman Thomas. You know, Rosa Luxemburg is as eloquent as anybody about free speech. The free speech movement at Berkeley was, you know, part of the foundation of the New Left. You know, this has always been something that was important to the left, you know, for you know, self-interested reasons, right? That like we knew that we couldn't trust, you know, the state with this kind of power, given that they're aligned with you know, the capitalist class, and also because it's integral to the kind of society that we want, right? You know, we want something with more avenues for expression and debate and collective decision making than we have. That we have under capitalism, which yeah, makes it really depressing to see like a certain kind of leftist like roll their eyes at the phrase free speech, or I don't know, I guess maybe this is a few years old, but make jokes about frozen peaches, you know, that kind of thing. And really, like I'd say that just fundamentally, like it's so like when people have this, oh, I don't like something, so my first instinct is going to be to go for whoever's in charge, oftentimes meaning some bizarrely evil parasitical corporation that doesn't at all have your interests at heart, right? And I'll just ask them to crack down on it. In a way, it's almost like not even doing politics, because if you're doing politics, you're interested in contesting for power, and you should have a vision of what you want the institutions to be, what you want the rules to be, right? And then that should guide, the way that you act. And so what we should be thinking about is, okay, sure, like not just like what results, right, there are, but like, yeah, all right, what would a reasonable like rule be like for like managing digital commons that, sure, maybe it would like exclude Alex Jones or somebody like that, right? But like, we also want for damn sure to make it that it's tightly defined enough, right? That it's not subjective enough that it can be used as an excuse to boot Michael Moore either. In this case, I mean, one of the weird things about this case is that for once they did explain themselves. Usually they really don't.
Right. And it took somebody, with that level of clout to even have the explanation that was so ludicrous to begin with. I mean, if they targeted some independent movie that nobody knew about and the director didn't have traditional media clout, then it would have just happened without any transparency. Ben Burgis.
If we were going to consistently enforce a rule against 4 seconds of copyright violation, like all that would be left of YouTube would be like 2 cat videos.
And probably actually not even those. Ben Burgis, author of Give Them an Argument, Logic for the Left, co-host of Dead Pundit Society. He's got his own great Patreon page. He's a professor. He writes regularly at Jacobin. Check out all of his pieces. Ben, thank you so much. Stay safe.
All right. Thanks, brother. You too.
Thank you, brother.
You just watched a Michael Brooks show video. Subscribe to get them all. Why wouldn't you? Don't be foolish. Click subscribe below and become a patron as well. Patreon.com/TMBS. Thanks, everybody.